The contract was 3 pages long and nobody had read all of it. That was the first sign. Darren Cole had read all of it, twice. Then he read it a third time with a glass of cheap station liquor sitting next to his hand, untouched, because he kept thinking he had missed something. He had not missed anything. The deal was exactly what it looked like. 40,000 trade credits in his account the moment he signed. All he had to do was take a ship. Not buy it, not bid on it. They were paying him to remove it from their records. He was sitting in a contract booth at Vorgel Station, which was the kind of place that existed because it was cheaper to build a station at the edge of nothing than to fly through nothing to get somewhere better. The walls were the color of old teeth. The air recyclers made a sound like a man clearing his throat every 40 seconds. Darren had been here for 6 days waiting for work, and his salvage rig, a beat-up hauler named the Rook, was currently docked on berth 12 with one engine running at 60% and the other one running at a number he preferred not to think about. 40,000 credits would fix both engines and leave enough over to eat something that was not protein paste for the next year. The man across the table was named Overseer Rellin. He worked for the Galactic Trade Consortium, which was a large and powerful organization that had the word trade in its name, but spent most of its energy on paperwork and politics. Rellin had soft hands and wore a jacket with too many buttons. He kept looking at his data tablet instead of at Darren. "The vessel is the ICS Ardent Grave," Rellin said, reading from the tablet. "Keth-class heavy dreadnought, commissioned 912 years ago, decommissioned 103 years ago. Currently in parking orbit at coordinates set 17-4 above the station." Darren already knew all of this. He had looked it up as soon as the job listing appeared. Why does the consortium want it gone? Rellin finally looked up. Because we cannot legally scrap it in system. There is a decommissioning protocol from 400 years ago that requires all Keth-class vessels to be destroyed outside of any populated orbital zone. The nearest legal disposal site is 14 transit jumps from here. We do not have the crew to move it. We do not have the budget to hire crew to move it. We listed it for disposal contract 8 months ago. "How many people passed on it?" Darren asked. Rellin's expression did not change. Several parties reviewed the listing. "That is not what I asked." A pause. 11 parties reviewed the listing. None accepted. Darren leaned back in the chair. He understood now why they had all passed. A 900-year-old warship with no functioning crew, no active systems, and a legal requirement to haul it across 14 transit jumps was a job for someone either very desperate or very stupid. The other 11 parties had decided they were neither. Darren was currently very desperate. He was willing to revisit the stupid question later. "The contract says I am not required to scrap it," he said. Rellin glanced at his tablet. "Correct. The contract requires only that you remove it from this orbital zone and from consortium registry. What you do with it afterward is not our concern. And the title transfers to me on completion of removal. On departure from the orbital zone, yes, the ship becomes your property such as it is." Such as it is. Darren had heard that phrase before, usually right before he found out something was worse than advertised. He had once bought a cargo lifter that was described as having minor hull wear, and it turned out the entire bottom panel was held on with industrial adhesive and hope. But this was different. A ship was a ship. Even a broken one was worth something if you knew what to do with it. He signed the contract. Rellin took the tablet back without ceremony. The credits cleared before Darren had stood up from the chair. He spent 40 minutes on the station buying supplies. Basic tools, welding compound, hull patch kits, 2 weeks of rations, and a diagnostic scanner that was 2 generations old but still worked. Then he went back to berth 12, ran the Rook through its pre-departure check, and flew up to coordinates set 17-4. The Ardent Grave was bigger than he had expected. He had looked at the specs. He knew the numbers, 900 meters from bow to stern, a hull cross-section that made the Rook look like a dust mote, but numbers were numbers and the actual ship was something else entirely. It sat in orbit the way a mountain sits on ground, not floating, just there, like it had always been there and the rest of space had arranged itself around it. The hull was dark gray, almost black in the shadow of the planet below. He could see the battle damage from 100 kilometers out. Long scoring marks along the port side where something had burned through the outer plating. A whole section of the bow was caved in, maybe 30 meters wide, sealed over with emergency patch foam that had hardened into something rough and brown, like a scar. One of the engine nacelles on the starboard side was completely missing. Not damaged. Gone. Whatever had taken it cleanly, and the space where it used to be was just open frame and hanging cable, all of it frozen in the stillness of vacuum. Darren brought the Rook in slow and docked at the first functioning dock ring he could find, which was the third one he tried. The first two had no power and would not cycle. The third had a small emergency light blinking red above the outer door, which meant there was at least minimal power somewhere, and after 10 minutes of manual override the airlock opened. He went in alone. He always worked alone. The inside of the ardent grave was dark and cold. His suit lights cut a narrow path through corridors wide enough to drive a vehicle through. The ship had been built at a time when crews numbered in the thousands, and everything was sized to match. Ceiling panels 2 stories up. Blast doors wide enough to march soldiers through 10 at a time. Corridors that branched and branched again into darkness he could not see the end of. He walked for almost an hour, mapping as he went, checking structural integrity with his scanner. Most of what he found was salvageable. The bones of the ship were solid. Whatever had happened to the outside had not reached the core. The reactor housing was intact. The power conduits were cold but unbroken. The weapon systems were locked behind security panels he had not expected to find still powered, even at minimal level. Then he found the room. It was a small room off a side corridor, sealed behind a door that had been welded shut from the inside. He cut through the weld with a torch and pushed the door open and found a storage space that had been converted into something else. Someone had built shelves in here. On the shelves were sealed containers, and in the containers were personal items. Clothes, small tools, a mechanical music box that had long since run down, a folded flag in a material he did not recognize. And in the back, flat against the wall, a data plaque. He pulled it out and wiped the dust off the screen and turned it on. It was a crew manifest, hand-entered, not system-generated. Names written one by one in 2 different sets of handwriting as though 2 people had taken turns. 712 names. Each one had a rank and a post. Some had small notes beside them. Held the engine room for 6 hours. Last one off deck 4. Did not leave a man behind. Darren read it standing in the dark of a dead ship, in a corridor that smelled of cold metal and old air, and he did not say anything for a long time. He folded the plaque carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his suit, against his chest. Then he went back to the Rook and started making a list of everything that needed to be fixed. Down on Vorgel Station, in the contract office, Overseer Relin filed the completed agreement and moved on to the next item on his schedule. He gave the ardent grave no further thought. It did not occur to him that he should. There is a kind of silence that only exists in deep space, far from stations and traffic lanes and the constant low noise of civilization. It is not the absence of sound. It is something heavier than that. It is the silence of something that has been waiting for a very long time. The ardent grave sat in that silence, and Darren Cole sat inside it, and he got to work. He was not a man who made plans in the sense of writing them down and reviewing them. He made lists. Fix this first, then that, then the thing behind that. He had a notebook, actual paper, that he kept in his chest pocket. Every morning he wrote the day's list. Every night he crossed off what was done and rolled the undone items to the next page. It was a habit he had picked up during 8 years in the Military Maintenance Corps, where the rule was simple: if it is broken and you are near it, fix it. If you cannot fix it today, know why not and come back tomorrow. He had been military once, not a soldier, a technician, the kind of person who spent deployments below deck with his hands inside engine housings while the people above him made decisions that got things blown up. He had been good at his job. He had also, eventually, been very tired of watching good equipment get wrecked through poor decisions, and when his service contract ended, he had not renewed it. Now he lived on a salvage rig and answered to nobody, which was the situation he had been aiming for. The ardent grave presented problems in a particular order, and he addressed them in that order. Power first. The ship's main reactor was intact but cold. It had been running on minimum trickle charge from a microcell array for a century, enough to keep the airlock cycling and the emergency lights blinking. Getting the reactor hot was a 3-day job. He ran diagnostics, found 2 failed control relays, pulled them out, machined replacements from stock material on the Rook, installed them and brought the reactor up in stages. It ran rough at first. He adjusted. By the end of the 3rd day, it was running at 40% capacity, which was more than enough for what he needed, and the internal lights came on throughout the ship, section by section, like a city coming awake after a long, dark night. Then atmosphere. The ship had been running on recycled air from sealed sections only. With power restored, he could run the full circulation system, which meant he could work without a suit in most of the interior. This mattered because working in a suit was slower and his gloves made fine work difficult. On day 4, he pulled off his helmet and breathed ship air for the first time. It tasted like metal and old dust. He had smelled worse. Structure next. He spent 4 days walking every accessible corridor with his scanner, logging damage and rating each section. Some areas were sealed due to breach. He documented those but left them for later. The core sections were solid. The Keth-class hull design was old, but the engineering behind it was not something he had seen before, which made him curious enough to look it up on his data terminal that evening. What he found was interesting. The alloy used in Keth-class construction was called Varic composite. It had been developed about 1,200 years ago by a species called the Keth, who were now extinct, which was why nobody built things out of it anymore. It was heavy and difficult to work with, and the manufacturing process required materials that were no longer easy to source. But it had one property that modern hull materials did not match. It was not just hard. It was specifically resistant to the kind of high-velocity penetrator rounds that most modern military vessels used as their primary anti-ship weapon. Not perfectly resistant, but the energy absorption ratios were significantly better than anything currently in production, because the weapons manufacturers of the current era had stopped designing penetrators to defeat Varic hull, because there were no Varic hulls left to defeat. Darren sat with that information for a while. Then he wrote "Hull Research" in his notebook with a small star beside it and kept going. On the 8th day, something unexpected happened. He was in the ship's central operations bay, a large hexagonal room at the geometric center of the vessel, where all the primary systems converged, trying to trace the path of a power conduit that had gone dead. He was lying on his back under a control panel, holding a light in one hand and a connector tool in the other, when a speaker above him made a sound. It was not a word. It was not quite a tone. It was the sound a system makes when it is trying to decide whether it is on or not. He stayed very still. The speaker made the sound again, then a 3rd time. Then a voice came out of it, low and rough and slow, like someone who had been asleep for a very long time and was not entirely sure what waking up meant. Status query, current date. Darren sat up and looked at the speaker. "You are asking me." A pause that lasted about 15 seconds. "Crew identifier not recognized. You are not on manifest." "That is correct. I am not on the original manifest. My name is Darren Cole. I own this ship now." Another pause, longer this time. "Last logged command authority, Commodore Edric Sarin, killed in action. 103 years ago. Ship placed in holding status pending reassignment. Reassignment never received. Darren nodded slowly. He had read about the battle in the historical records he had pulled when he first took the contract. The Ardent Grave had been the last surviving ship of its fleet group after a campaign that the consortium had won by the narrowest possible margin, and then immediately tried to forget about. The ship was decommissioned and then put in storage orbit. The people who were supposed to deal with it never did. Understood. The AI's voice was flat and careful. It did not sound angry. It sounded like a machine that had processed something and was holding its conclusions very close. Ownership documentation available for review. Darren pulled out his data tablet and held it up toward the speaker, which was not necessary since the AI had access to all onboard sensor systems, but it felt like the right thing to do. The AI went quiet for about 2 minutes. He waited. Documentation accepted. Registered owner Darren Cole, awaiting further orders. First order, Darren said. Tell me what is working and what is not. The list took 40 minutes. Some of it was better than he had hoped. The structural integrity of the main hull was at 81%, which was remarkable for a ship of its age that had seen as much combat as this one. The weapon systems were intact, locked behind command ciphers, but intact. The navigation core was cold, but the hardware was undamaged. The secondary drives could be brought online. The main drive was the biggest problem. One of the 3 primary engine units was physically missing, as he had seen from outside. The other 2 were present but required significant overhaul. He had parts for small engines. He did not have parts for anything this size. He would need to improvise, fabricate, or source elsewhere. He told the AI he was going to keep working, and he would check in at the end of each day. Understood, the AI said. I am going to call you Grave, Darren said, because calling it the ship felt lazy and he was not going to call it a number. Unless you prefer something else. A pause. Grave is acceptable. Darren went back to work. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern developed. He would work through the day, focused on whatever was highest on his list. In the evenings, he would sit in the operations bay with his notebook and talk through problems with Grave, who turned out to be methodical and precise in a way that was genuinely useful. Grave had a complete technical record of every system on the ship. It did not offer opinions unprompted, but when asked, it answered directly and without decoration. On the 18th day, Darren was testing the secondary weapon targeting systems as part of a power routing check, not expecting much, when all 12 secondary batteries lit up in sequence, and the targeting array swept across a 180-degree arc with a smoothness that suggested it had not, in fact, been sitting unused for a century. He stared at the readout for a moment. Grave, the weapons. Secondary batteries are at full operational capacity, Grave said. Primary batteries require charge cycling. The command cipher lock was resolved. I did not resolve the cipher. A short pause. You began the brute force sequence on day 11. It completed at approximately 2:30 this morning. Darren thought back. He had started poking at the cipher lock mostly out of habit, running a background process while he worked on other things. He had not expected it to work. How long did the original design say that cipher would take to break without the key? The original design documentation stated 40 years minimum for a non-keyed brute force approach. He looked at the readout again. Grave, I did it in 7 days. Yes, Grave said, and there was something in its voice that he could not quite name. Not offense exactly. Something more like wounded professional pride from an entity that had not expected to feel anything. The cipher protocol was designed in an era when computational standards were considerably different. Right, Darren said carefully. He decided not to press the point. He sat in the operations bay that night with his notebook open and his pen still, and looked at the weapons readouts for a long time. He was no longer looking at a broken salvage job. He was looking at something else entirely, and he was beginning to understand why 11 other parties had walked away from this contract. They had looked at it and seen a problem. He had looked at it and seen a project. He wrote tomorrow's list. It was longer than usual. Far below him, on Vorgel Station, in the energy monitoring office on sublevel 3, a junior technician named Asa noticed that the power output reading from coordinate 17-4 had increased significantly over the past 2 weeks. She flagged it in her log as an anomaly and sent a low-priority report to the station oversight department. The oversight department received the report, assigned it a case number, and added it to a queue of 417 other low-priority reports. Nobody read it for 9 days. It was not supposed to be a confrontation. Darren was not interested in confrontations. He was interested in getting from point A to point B with a hold full of salvage and no complications, which was the same thing he had been interested in every day for the past 4 years of his life. The problem was that the Boral shipping corridor did not know what he was interested in, and neither did Captain Droven. The Ardent Grave moved through the corridor at about a third of its possible transit speed, because that was where the secondary drive topped out for now, and Darren was fine with that. Speed was not the point yet. What he needed was to cross the corridor to reach the salvage yard at Paul Station, where he had a contact who could source 2 of the 3 engine components he still needed to fully restore the main drive. He had the Rook tethered in the lower dock bay. He was flying the Dreadnought solo, with Grave handling most of the piloting calculations, which meant the actual experience of flying a 900-meter warship alone was something between humbling and absurd. He was in the operations bay eating a meal that had started as freeze-dried noodles and had ended as something worse, reviewing the engine part list on his data terminal, when Grave spoke. Patrol vessel on intercept course. Syndicate markings. They are signaling for us to reduce speed and prepare for inspection. Darren set down his noodles. What type of vessel? Brent-class enforcement cruiser, 160 meters, standard patrol armament, 4 crew, estimated 12 to 15 boarding personnel. 160 meters, he almost smiled. Run the transponder, let them see what we are. Transponder active. They have received our identification. There was a pause of about 2 minutes during which Darren imagined the crew of the enforcement cruiser looking at their screen, seeing the name Ardent Grave and the registered class of the vessel, and having what was probably a very interesting conversation with one another. Then the radio opened. Unidentified vessel. This is Syndicate Patrol Cruiser Orin. You are operating a decommissioned military dreadnought in an active commercial corridor under a merchant transit flag. This is irregular. You will reduce speed to 0 and prepare for boarding inspection. Any resistance will be considered a violation of Corridor Regulation 12. Darren picked up the radio handset. Patrol Cruiser Orin, this is the ICS Ardent Grave, registered to Darren Cole, salvage operator under full merchant transit authority. My paperwork is current. Happy to transmit documentation. Another pause. He heard, faintly in the background of the open channel, a second voice on their end saying something he could not quite make out. The word dreadnought was in there somewhere. Ardent Grave, we require physical inspection. Reduce speed and prepare port airlock for boarding. Darren looked at Graves' display. He had met syndicate patrol captains before. There were good ones and bad ones. The good ones did their jobs and left you alone if your paperwork was clean. The bad ones found reasons to hold you until you paid them something to leave. The Boral corridor had a reputation, and Droven's name had come up twice in the salvage network forums attached to the word shakedown. He reduced speed. He opened the port airlock. He let them board. There were 9 of them, in full enforcement kit, which was heavier armor than a standard customs check required. They came aboard in a line and spread through the entry corridor, and their team leader, A blocky man with a close-cut beard and the body language of someone who expected to be obeyed, introduced himself as Captain Droven. Droven looked at the corridor. He looked at the ceiling, 2 stories above him. He looked at the blast doors and the scale of everything around him, and to his credit, he kept his expression mostly neutral, though Darren noticed his eyes moving fast, taking in more than his face was giving away. "License and cargo manifest," Droven said. Darren handed him the data chip with everything on it. Droven passed it to one of his officers without looking at it. "This vessel is listed as a merchant salvage operation. You are flying a military warship under a merchant flag." "I am flying a decommissioned former military vessel that is now registered as salvage property," Darren said. "There is a legal distinction. That distinction is at the discretion of the inspecting officer." Darren waited. He had been in enough of these to know when the other person was getting to the point. Droven got to the point. "Your cargo manifest lists salvage components and personal equipment. We will need to verify this against a physical inspection of your hold areas. Given the size of this vessel, that inspection will require a hold fee of approximately 300 credits per inspecting officer per hour, minimum 4 hours. There it was. 300 credits times 9 officers times 4 hours minimum was 10,800 credits. For a cargo inspection that would find exactly what the manifest said it would find, which was salvage components and personal equipment. Darren looked at Droven for a moment. Then he said no. Droven blinked. People did not usually say no this quickly. "Excuse me." "No," Darren said again. "I'm not paying a hold fee. My documentation is current. Your Regulation 12 applies to vessels that refuse inspection, not to vessels that refuse to pay an unlicensed fee for one. If you want to conduct a standard inspection at no charge, the manifest is already in your officer's hands and you are welcome to walk the cargo hold. I will show you myself. But if you are telling me I have to pay 10,000 credits to leave a corridor, I have legal right to transit, then we have a different kind of problem." Droven's face went through several expressions in quick succession. He settled on the one that said he was reconsidering his approach. He glanced past Darren at the corridor behind him. Then he glanced at the data chip his officer was holding. Then he said slowly, "I will need to verify your vessel's operational status before I can clear you for transit. A vessel of this class operating under a salvage designation is unusual. I will need confirmation that your weapon systems are non-functional." Darren had been expecting this one too. He turned and looked at the panel on the wall beside him, which happened to be a secondary weapons status panel, because nearly every panel on this ship was a secondary weapons status panel. He had not turned it on when they boarded. He turned it on now. The display lit up. 12 secondary battery status lights, all green. Targeting array, green. Power routing, green. On the left side of the display, in text that even Droven could read from 3 meters away, it said WAPONS SYSTEMS operational. From the speaker in the ceiling, Graves' voice came through with the calm tone of a system reading a prepared statement. "This is the ICS Ardent Grave, commissioned vessel under current registry. Weapon systems are confirmed operational. Forward gun array warm-up cycle completed approximately 4 minutes ago." Darren had not asked Grave to do that, but he was not going to argue with the timing. There was a silence in the corridor that lasted about 6 seconds, which is a very long time when 9 armed people are in a room with a weapons status board glowing green in front of them. Then Droven cleared his throat. "Your documentation appears to be in order." "I thought it might," Darren said. "We will not be conducting a physical inspection at this time." "Understood." Droven looked at the weapons board one more time. He looked at Darren. Then he looked at his own officers in a way that communicated without words. That they were leaving and they were leaving now, and this was not to be discussed. They left. Darren watched the Orin break away on the tracking display and adjust to a new heading that took it to the far edge of the corridor. He stood there for a moment after they were gone. "Grave," he said. "Yes." "The forward gun array warm-up cycle. I did not tell you to run that." A pause that he was beginning to recognize as Grave choosing its words. The timing was appropriate. "I know the timing was appropriate. I am asking why you did it without being told." Another pause. Threat assessment. The boarding party showed indicators consistent with extortion patterns. I determined that information about weapon status was likely to be useful to you. Darren considered that. A century-old AI on a ship everyone had written off had just run an independent tactical assessment and acted on it correctly in real time. "Next time tell me what you are planning to do before you do it," he said. "Understood," Graves said, and then after a moment, "My apologies. I have not had anyone to coordinate with for some time. I may need adjustment." He picked up his noodles. They were cold now. He ate them anyway and thought about the word adjustment, and what it meant when an AI said it, and whether what was sitting in the ceiling above him was broken in a way that could be fixed or broken in a way that had made it into something more interesting than it had started out as. He did not file a report about Droven when he reached Paul Station. He saw no reason to. Droven had backed down. Nobody had been hurt. Nothing had been damaged. But the dockworker who refueled the Rook at Paul Station had seen the ardent Grave sitting in the outer dock ring and had asked about it. And Darren had explained briefly. And the dockworker had told two other people. And one of them had told someone on the consortium freight network. And within 48 hours the story was moving through the shipping lanes, the way stories always move through shipping lanes, which was fast and with additions. By the time the story reached Vorgel Station, it included the detail that the human salvage operator had fired on the patrol vessel, which was not true, but was more interesting than what had actually happened, and people generally prefer interesting. Overseer Relin heard about it on his third cup of morning tea and dismissed it as rumor. He filed a note to himself to look into it later. He did not look into it later. Darren was under the secondary drive housing with both arms inside a casing that smelled of burned coolant when Graves said, "There is something on the network you may want to see." "Is it urgent?" "It is relevant." "Those are different things." "Yes," Graves said, "it is not urgent." He kept working. He had the thread of a misaligned coupling between his fingers and he needed another 40 seconds to get it seated properly, and if he let go now, he would have to start over. "Tell me about it." "There is a post on the Independent Freight Network. It is a discussion thread. The subject is your encounter with the patrol vessel in the Boral corridor." "How long has it been up?" 11 days. He had been at Paul Station for 11 days, sourcing parts and working on the drive. He had not been checking the freight network. He did not usually check the freight network because it was mostly complaints about fuel prices and arguments about docking fees. "How long is the thread?" 412 replies as of this morning. His hand stopped moving. 412. He got the coupling seated, extracted his arms from the casing, sat up, and looked at the speaker mounted in the corner of the engine bay. "What are they saying?" Grave read him several excerpts. The story had evolved considerably from what had actually happened. In the most popular version, the patrol vessel had trained guns on the ardent Grave, and Darren had responded by bringing the dreadnought's entire forward battery online and informing Captain Droven that he had 90 seconds to leave. In another version, the ship had broadcast its old military commission code on an emergency channel, which had caused the patrol vessel's own systems to temporarily register it as a superior command authority. Neither of these things had happened. What had happened was that Grave had turned on the warm-up cycle, and Droven had decided he had other places to be. The freight network, however, preferred the more dramatic version. There was a reason for that. Darren wiped his hands on a work rag and sat on the edge of the drive housing and thought about this for a while. Are any of these people going to be a problem? Some of them are interesting, Graves said. There is a faction within the thread arguing that the Ardent Graves weapons cannot actually be operational, and that the patrol vessel backed down because of bureaucratic uncertainty rather than an actual threat. Several others are arguing that the consortium sold a functioning warship for 40,000 credits and should be investigated for negligence. What about the rest? They are largely discussing where the ship might be headed next and whether a human owning a Keth-class vessel is historically precedented. Is it? No, Graves said, it is not. He went back to the drive housing. He had work to do. But 3 days later, when the thread had grown to 900 replies and someone had posted the actual contract documents, which they had apparently obtained through a public records request to the consortium's clerical office, the situation became something he could not entirely ignore. What he could not ignore was what happened on the day he left Paul Station. He was conducting a departure systems check when Grave flagged an incoming message, not a network post, an actual transmission, type beam, addressed to the Ardent Grave by name. The sender identifier was from a fleet registry he did not recognize. He had Grave decode the origin. It was Ket's Reach. Ket's Reach was not a station in the traditional sense. It was a collection of docked and linked vessels that had been in the same position long enough to be considered a permanent structure, anchored at a gravitational point between two uninhabited moons. It was where a pirate fleet called the Reach Collective operated from. They were not especially powerful as pirate operations went, but they were well organized, and they had been running the outer freight lanes for about 15 years. The message was brief. It said, "We have heard about your ship. We are interested in acquiring it. Name your price or we will make an offer you cannot refuse." It was signed by someone who called themselves Fleet Captain Suro. Darren read the message twice. Then he forwarded it to his own archive without replying and continued his departure check. 2 days after he left Paul Station, Grave detected 3 fast attack vessels on an intercept course. They were running without transponders, which was itself an answer to any question about who they were. They were small ships, faster than the Ardent Grave at its current speed, and they closed the distance in about 6 hours. Darren was in the operations bay when they arrived. He did not power up weapons. He did not maneuver. He sat in his chair and watched the tracking display and waited. The 3 ships took positions at standard intercept formation, one ahead and one to each side, the way you set up if you intended to board something large and slow. A voice came over the open channel, no introduction, just, "Cut your drive. Prepare to receive boarding crew. The ship becomes property of the Reach Collective. You will be unharmed." Darren reached over and turned on the primary weapon targeting display. All primary batteries, which he had finished bringing online 4 days earlier, showed green. He did not power them. He just let the display show what it showed. Then he said, into the open channel, "I am going to give you 60 seconds to make a different decision." The 3 ships held position for about 20 seconds. Then one of them broke formation, which caused the other 2 to break formation to maintain spacing, and then all 3 of them were moving in different directions, and the intercept was over. He did not fire a single shot. What happened after was simpler and more final. The 3 attack ships did not return to Ket's Reach, not because they were destroyed. They had simply turned and left in different directions, and apparently none of their crews had felt like going home and explaining what had happened. 2 days later, a cargo pod arrived at Ket's Reach from an unspecified origin point. Inside the pod were 3 ship transponders, nothing else, no message. Just the transponders sitting in an empty container that had clearly been sent deliberately and with intent. Fleet Captain Suro stared at the transponders for a long time. Then she held a fleet meeting at which she said, very clearly, that the ardent grave was not a target. It was not discussed after that. What happened next was not something Darren planned for. He was transiting the outer edge of the Pellin route, a secondary commercial lane that human settlers used because it was longer but cheaper than the primary corridors, when Grave flagged a distress pattern in the standard emergency band. Not a full emergency call. A repeating low-signal pulse of the kind a ship uses when it cannot broadcast full power but wants to indicate presence. He followed it. What he found was a convoy. 14 ships, a mix of old freighters and converted colony transports, all running slow and low. They were clustered together the way small ships cluster when they feel watched, which meant there was something watching them. There was. 2 mercenary vessels were holding position at the far end of the route ahead of the convoy, and they were broadcasting on the convoy frequency, a message that said, in short, that transit through the next segment required a security fee that was equivalent to roughly half of everything each ship was carrying. It was not technically piracy. It was the kind of thing that occupied the space between legal and illegal that mercenaries were good at finding. Darren brought the ardent grave alongside the convoy and held position there. He did not say anything to the mercenaries. He did not broadcast anything. He just parked a 900-meter Keth-class dreadnought between the convoy and the 2 mercenary ships and sat there. He spoke to the convoy commander on a direct channel, a woman named Farron who ran a colony transport and spoke in the clipped, careful way of someone who had learned to be precise, because imprecision had cost her things before. She told him the convoy was carrying settlers, families, people who had been displaced from their home colony by a consortium territory reassignment that had transferred their land to a resource extraction company. They were going to a secondary settlement 2 lanes over that had agreed to take them. The mercenaries had been hired by the resource extraction company to delay them. Darren sat with that information for a while. Then he opened the mercenary channel. He identified himself and the ship. He said very plainly that the convoy would be transiting the route and that there would be no fee collected today or any other day from these ships on this route. He did not threaten. He did not describe what would happen if they disagreed. He simply stated the situation and then went quiet. The mercenary vessels left within the hour. He escorted the convoy to the entry point of the secondary lane and then broke off. Farron thanked him. He told her it was not necessary. She said she was going to tell people what had happened, and he told her she could do whatever she wanted. He had not expected the result of that. Someone in the convoy had a recording device. The footage of the ardent grave sitting beside 14 small colony ships, between them and the 2 mercenary vessels, circulated across the human diaspora network, and then out from there into the broader commercial lanes. It was not dramatic footage. It was just a very large, dark ship sitting very still. But context is everything, and the context turned out to matter enormously. The thread on the freight network went from 900 replies to 6,000 in 4 days. A news outlet in the outer human settlements ran a piece with the headline, "Humanity's Forgotten Warship Returns." Darren read the headline, closed the page, and went back to his engine work. He told Grave to stop accepting hails from organizations he did not recognize. Grave said it had not been accepting them. Darren was not entirely sure that was true, but he let it go. What he did not let go was the freight network thread, which he read through fully one evening, sitting alone in the operations bay with the crew manifest plaque on the console in front of him. He read what people were saying. The relief in some of the posts was visible even through plain text. Settlers who had been paying the corridor fees for years. Merchants who had been avoiding certain lanes. Families on colony ships who had received the same kind of visit from the same kind of mercenaries. He did not think of himself as a symbol. He did not want to be one. He was a man with a salvage rig who had made a practical decision about a piece of property that everyone else had decided was worthless. But he looked at the manifest on the console and thought about the 712 names on it, and what those people had been, and what they had done, and the fact that a century later nobody had remembered to honor them properly. He thought maybe the ship had been waiting for someone to fix it for a reason. He decided that was probably a sentimental thought and went back to work. The document arrived while Darren was installing the last of the 3 replacement engine components that had taken him 2 months to source, fabricate, and fit. It came as a certified legal transmission, which meant it played a chime and sat in his queue marked urgent and would not move to read status until he acknowledged it personally. He acknowledged it from the engine bay, read the first paragraph, and then went and sat down somewhere comfortable before reading the rest. The Galactic Trade Consortium, through its legal division, had filed a vessel recovery order against the ICS Ardent Grave. The document was 47 pages long and cited 11 separate regulatory codes. The short version, which he reached by skipping to the summary section on page 3, was this. The consortium claimed that under Clause 9 of the original disposal contract, if the removed vessel was used in any action classified as hostile engagement within 5 years of transfer, and if the vessel was not subsequently registered with a recognized military or governmental authority, then the transfer was considered incomplete and ownership reverted to the consortium. The consortium classified 2 events as hostile engagements. The first was the confrontation with Captain Droven in the Boral Corridor. The second was the intercept of the 3 attack vessels from Ket's Reach. He read the document 3 times. On the 3rd reading, he pulled out his notebook and made notes in the margins of his paper copy, because he liked being able to see his own handwriting when he was thinking. "Grave," he said, "tell me about Clause 9. "I have read it," Grave said. "I have also read the original disposal contract in full, including the attached appendices. And Clause 9 was added to the contract template by the Consortium Legal Office 4 years ago as part of a broader revision to their commercial disposal procedures. The version of the contract you signed contains it." That was not what he wanted to hear. "All right, what else?" "The original decommissioning documents for this vessel are more interesting," Grave said. He looked at the speaker. "Go on." When the Ardent Grave was decommissioned 103 years ago, the legal authority for disposal was recorded as resting with the Galactic Trade Consortium. This record was used as the basis for the contract you signed. However, the actual decommissioning order was issued by the Joint Fleet Authority, which was the military command structure at the time of the last campaign. The Joint Fleet Authority transferred authority to the consortium for record-keeping purposes only, specifically for archive maintenance, not for disposal rights. Darren stopped writing. "That is different." Yes, the record of that distinction was present in the decommissioning files, but was not preserved in the consortium's public registry. They recorded themselves as having full disposal authority when in fact they had only archival authority. So when they listed the ship for disposal contract, they did not legally have the right to do so. The disposal contract was based on a fraudulent authority claim. The transfer was invalid. He sat with that for a long moment. "Where is the original decommissioning order?" "In my own records," Graves said. "I maintained a copy of all commission and decommissioning documentation in my core archive. It was part of my standard operational protocol. I have maintained it for 103 years. Darren looked at the ceiling. He looked at the speaker. He looked back at the legal document on his data terminal. The consortium had tried to take back a ship they had fraudulently given away in the first place, using a clause they had inserted into a contract that should never have been valid. The problem with finding this out was knowing what to do with it. He was one man with a salvage operator license and a large old warship. The consortium was a galactic-scale organization with lawyers in every port and political relationships in every jurisdiction. Even if he was right, being right was not the same as being safe. The consortium had also hired the VEC reclaimers. He found that out on day 3 after receiving the legal notice, when Grave flagged a fleet of 6 vessels approaching on a standard intercept vector. The VEC reclaimers were a legitimate bounty and recovery operation, not pirates, which meant they operated within legal frameworks and would not fire on him first. They also would not leave without what they came for unless given a very good reason. He moved the Ardent Grave to a way station called Dunner Point and docked at the outer ring, which put him inside a civilian station environment where any weapons discharged by either party would be a serious legal violation. Then he waited. The VEC reclaimers arrived in 6 hours. Their lead ship docked at the adjacent berth, and a legal officer came aboard with 2 assistants and a recovery authorization document. The legal officer's name was listed on her badge as Warrant Investigator Solène. She was professional in the way that people are professional when they work in a field where losing their composure costs them credibility. She sat across from Darren in the station meeting room he had rented for the hour and placed the recovery authorization on the table between them. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I am not here to argue about whether you have improved this vessel or whether your use of it was justified. I am here to execute a recovery order issued by the Galactic Trade Consortium under Clause 9 of your disposal contract. I would prefer to do this without complication." "I understand," Darren said. "Before we go any further, I need to transmit some documents." She looked at him carefully. "To whom?" "To every independent legal registry currently operating in this sector, and to the Joint Fleet Authority Historical Archive, and to the consortium's own compliance office." She kept looking at him. "What documents?" He turned his data terminal around so she could see the screen. On it was the original decommissioning order for the Ardent Grave, with the Joint Fleet Authority seal intact, and the specific language about archival versus disposal authority highlighted in yellow. Solène read it slowly. She read it again. Something in her expression shifted, not much, just enough to tell him she understood what she was looking at. "The consortium recorded themselves as having disposal rights," Darren said. "They did not have disposal rights. They had archival rights. The disposal contract I signed was based on an authority claim they could not legally make. That means Clause 9, which is drawn from that contract, is also void." He sent the documents while she was still looking at the screen, to every registry he had listed, to the Historical Archive, to the Compliance Office, all at once. Solène sat back in her chair. She looked at the recovery authorization document on the table between them. Then she picked it up and put it back in her case. "I will need to contact the consortium for clarification on the legal basis of this order before I can proceed." "Of course," he said. "This will take time." "I understand." She stood up. She was very controlled about it. "Mr. Cole, this is not over." "I know," he said. She left. The 6 reclaimer ships departed Dunner Point within the hour, which he had not expected to happen that quickly. He had expected them to hold position while the legal question was sorted out. The fact that they left suggested their internal legal team had reached a conclusion about the documents faster than he had anticipated. He sent a copy of everything to a lawyer he knew on Pellon Station, a woman named Teva who handled commercial disputes and charged reasonable rates. He told her what had happened. She called him back in 2 hours and said 3 things. First, his reading of the decommissioning authority was correct. Second, the consortium's compliance office had already filed an internal review order, which she could see in the public regulatory filings, which meant someone inside the consortium had read his documents and panicked slightly. Third, he should register the ship formally under some recognized authority before the consortium found a different legal angle. He sat in the Ardent Grave's operations bay that night and worked on the third problem. Registering a vessel required a flag. A flag required a recognized authority. He was a single person with no nation and no government and no organization behind him. Most registries required applicants to be corporations, governments, or licensed commercial entities of a type he did not qualify as. Grave, he said, what are my options? Grave thought about it. Grave thought about it for a long time, which was unusual. There is a document in my archival records. It is not a decommissioning document. It is a commerce charter. What kind? A deep space free merchant charter. It was issued approximately 220 years ago by a multi-species commercial council that no longer exists. The charter granted the right of sovereign commercial registry to any licensed merchant operating exclusively beyond the primary inhabited zones. The charter was never formally revoked. It was simply forgotten when the council dissolved. Darren stared at the ceiling. Is it still legally valid? A right that is never revoked remains in force until a superseding authority explicitly cancels it. No superseding authority has addressed this charter because no one has invoked it in approximately 160 years. He looked at Graves' display for a long time. Then he pulled out his notebook and started writing. It took him 4 days to file the paperwork, because the charter required a commercial registry with specific documentation that the charter itself described, and none of the current registry offices had forms for it because nobody had used it in over a century. He had to cite the original charter in every form and explain what it was and why it applied. 3 registry offices rejected his filing because they did not understand it. The fourth, a small independent registry at a station called Orvin Point, whose chief registrar was apparently a person with both legal expertise and an appreciation for historical documents, approved it after 2 days of review. The ICS Ardent Grave was registered under the Free Merchant Sovereign Charter, operator Darren Cole, as a commercially sovereign independent vessel. He put the registration document on his terminal and looked at it for a while. You are technically a sovereign entity now, Graves said. I know, Darren said. I am trying not to think about that too hard. The consortium's legal team has filed 3 objections to the charter registration in the last 6 hours, Graves said. None of them have been accepted by the registry. The charter registration is holding. He nodded slowly. The ship was his, legally, clearly, with documentation that predated the consortium's own founding charter by about 40 years. They had no angle left. At least, not a legal one. He wrote the next day's list in his notebook. It was short. There was 1 item. He looked at it for a long time. Then he added a second item below the first, which said, "Be ready for what comes next." He was under no illusion that the consortium was finished. They were embarrassed, which in his experience was a more dangerous condition than merely being angry. Angry people make decisions. Embarrassed people with power make examples. He put the notebook away and went to check the engine status. All 3 drives were online. The Ardent Grave could run at full transit speed for the first time in over a century. He stood in the engine bay and listened to the sound of it, a deep and steady hum that resonated through the floor and the walls and the hull and everything inside. A ship that had been silent for 100 years, running again. He put his hand against the bulkhead, the way you put your hand against a wall when you want to feel what is on the other side. The ship hummed back. The invitation arrived formatted as a peace offer, which was how Darren knew it was a trap. It came on official consortium stationery, sealed with a code that only activated when he authenticated it with his personal ID, which was a detail that told him they wanted to make sure he read it personally and could not later claim ignorance. The message was courteous. It acknowledged that recent events had created some legal complexity. It expressed the consortium's desire to resolve the situation through direct negotiation, as reasonable parties with a mutual interest in stability. It invited Darren Cole to attend a formal negotiating session at Vorgel Station, which was where all of this had started, in 7 days. It did not say what the consortium intended to offer. Darren read the invitation. He checked the attached documentation, which included a guest berth confirmation at Vorgel Station's inner dock ring, a commercial safe passage guarantee, and the names of the consortium representatives who would attend. Overseer Relin was on the list. So were 4 people above Relin in the organizational structure, which meant the consortium was taking this seriously at a level they had not been before. He spent a day thinking about it. Then he spent another half-day talking to his lawyer Teva, who had reviewed everything with the careful attention of someone who expected to be surprised. The safe passage guarantee is legitimate, Teva told him. They cannot legally detain you under it, but the docking berth is interesting. If you bring the Ardent Grave into inner dock, you are subject to station security protocols, which means the station authority has the right to conduct an emergency hold on any vessel deemed a security risk. The consortium has relationships with Vorgel Station Security Office. He had already thought of that. What if they try to hold the ship while I am in the meeting? Then you are in the meeting without your ship, and the meeting has no time limit in the invitation. They could extend it indefinitely while the security hold is sorted out. These things take weeks. He thought about that for a while. All right, thank you. He sent a reply accepting the invitation. He did not mention the Ardent Grave's docking arrangements. On the day of the meeting, he departed for Vorgel Station in the Rook, the same small salvage hauler he had started all of this with. The Ardent Grave held position at a coordinate point 100 kilometers from the station, with Grave running all systems on passive and staying off active sensors. From the station's traffic control perspective, the Ardent Grave was not there. He docked the Rook at a public outer berth and walked into the station, and found the conference room they had listed in the invitation. It was a good room. Round table, 8 seats, proper ventilation, the kind of room organizations use when they want an encounter to feel formal and balanced. All 5 consortium representatives were already seated. Relin was at the far end, looking at his data tablet. The 4 above him were looking at Darren with the focused attention of people who had been briefed on the situation and were making real-time assessments. There was a holographic projector in the center of the table. The chair at Darren's end of the table had been left empty for him. He sat down. The most senior consortium representative introduced himself as Director Oving. He had the manner of someone who had negotiated difficult things before and was confident in his ability to reach favorable outcomes. He thanked Darren for coming. He said the consortium recognized that the legal situation had become complicated. He said the consortium was prepared to offer a formal commercial operating agreement that would give the Ardent Grave recognized status in consortium-adjacent space, full corridor transit rights, and a retroactive commercial license for the vessel's operations to date. In exchange, the consortium wanted to add an external oversight representative to the ship's operating registry, which would give them co-signatory authority on the vessel's movements in sensitive zones. Darren listened to all of this. Then he said, I appreciate the offer, but I have a different proposal. Director Oven's expression remained neutral. We are listening. I am going to transmit something to this room, Darren said. He took out his data terminal and activated it. Nothing happened in the room immediately. But on the Ardent Grave, 100 kilometers away, Grave executed a pre-prepared sequence. A connection opened from the ship's communications array to the holographic projector in the conference room, patched through a relay node Darren had set up the previous day through the public station network. The holographic projector lit up. Darren appeared in it, not physically, holographically, a projection of him sitting at the console of the Ardent Grave's operations bay, with the weapon's status displays visible in the background, all green. The consortium representatives looked from the real Darren to the projection and back again. "I am transmitting from the ship," the projection said. "My physical presence at this table is a courtesy. My ship is elsewhere. Wherever you were planning to have it held while I was in this meeting, it is not there." Director Ovin was very still. Relin had stopped looking at his data tablet. "I'm also transmitting from the ship's archive," Darren said, from both his actual mouth and the projection simultaneously, which was mildly disorienting even for him. "As you are aware, the Ardent Grave spent the better part of a century in parking orbit adjacent to your administrative hub at Vorgel. During that time, its passive sensor array continued recording, as passive sensor arrays do when there is nobody to turn them off. Grave has maintained those records continuously." He let that sit for a moment. "I have not reviewed what is in those records," he said. "I have not shared those records with anyone. I have no current intention of sharing those records. I mention them only because I believe in transparency." Director Ovin looked at him for a long time. "What do you want, Mr. Cole?" Darren had written his terms on a paper in his notebook 3 days ago. He pulled the notebook out and set it on the table so they could see he was reading from it. "First," he said, "the crew manifest of the Ardent Grave is to be submitted to the Joint Fleet Authority Historical Archive as an official war record. 712 names, each one listed with rank, post, and action. Within 60 days, the consortium will fund the archival process." Nobody objected. "Second, a formal public acknowledgement that the crew of the Ardent Grave served with distinction, not a press release, an official record, something that exists in the permanent registry and does not get deleted in 10 years. Still nobody objected. Third, safe transit rights for independent human merchant vessels in the Pellin route, the Boral secondary corridor, and the Dunner approach lane. No inspection fees, no corridor security charges, standard commercial transit at standard rates. Director Ovin said, "The Boral secondary corridor involves a syndicate jurisdiction agreement." "I know," Darren said. "I also know the syndicate's jurisdiction agreement in that corridor expired 14 months ago and has not been renewed, which is why operations like Captain Drovin's have been running unchallenged. You have a window to establish clean corridor standards before the syndicate renegotiates. I suggest using it." A pause. Director Ovin exchanged a look with the person to his left. "Fourth," Darren said, "the 40,000 credits I was paid to take this ship, plus interest at the standard commercial rate for 103 years, as retroactive compensation for unauthorized custody of property belonging to the Joint Fleet Authority, which was subsequently transferred to me through the commercial charter process. You can work out the math. My lawyer already has." Relin made a small sound. Darren did not look at him. "And fifth," Darren said, "leave me alone. No recovery orders. No Clause 9 interpretations. No regulatory reviews. No consortium observers on my registry. My ship, my operations, my routes. You get what I have listed above. I get to go back to work." He closed the notebook. Director Ovin looked at his colleagues. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ovin said, "You mentioned the archive records." "I mentioned them," Darren agreed. "And I mentioned that I have not reviewed them and have no current intention of sharing them." "And if we do not agree to your terms?" Darren looked at him steadily. "Then I would have more free time, and free time leads to curiosity, and curiosity leads to people reviewing old data files that have been sitting in storage for 100 years. Another silence. This one lasted longer. Then Director Ovin said, "We will need 6 hours to review these terms internally." "Of course," Darren said. It took them 5 hours and 40 minutes. The formal agreement arrived in his queue before he had finished his second cup of coffee. All 5 terms accepted. The archival funding was already transferred. A consortium official had apparently contacted the Joint Fleet Authority Historical Archive within the hour, which suggested someone had been standing by ready to make the call. He sat in the Rook's small cockpit and read through the agreement. It was clean. No hidden clauses. Teva reviewed it remotely and told him it was exactly what he had asked for. He signed it. He sat there for a while after, looking at the screen. Then he flew the Rook back out to where the Ardent Grave was waiting, docked in the lower bay, and walked up through the familiar corridors to the operations bay. The lights were on. The hum of all three main drives ran under everything like a heartbeat. He sat down in the primary operator's chair, which he had never officially named a captain's chair, but which he had come to think of that way. He took the crew manifest plaque out of his pocket and pinned it to the bulkhead above the main console. He had kept it in his pocket since the day he found it. He smoothed it flat against the metal and stepped back and looked at it. 712 names, in 2 different sets of handwriting. It would be in a formal archive within 60 days. It would be there permanently, as a record that these people had existed and had done something worth remembering. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only thing he had cared about from the beginning, the only reason any of the rest of it had felt like it mattered. "Grave," he said. "Yes." "Plot a course for the Renner salvage lane. Sector 9. There is a derelict beacon out there that nobody has gone to look at because it is in an inconvenient location." "Course plotted," Graves said. "Estimated transit time, 14 hours at current drive output." "Run it." The drives shifted register slightly as the ship adjusted its heading. Through the forward viewport, the stars moved, slow and steady, as the Ardent Grave turned toward the dark. "Grave," he said. "Yes." "For the record, you did well." There was a pause. Grave did not say anything like thank you. It did not say it was just doing its job. It said, quietly and without any decoration, "I have been waiting a long time to be useful again." He nodded once and looked at the stars. The consortium had paid him 40,000 credits to take a broken ship because they believed it was worthless. They believed it was worthless because they had looked at the hull damage and the missing engine and the century of silence, and they had decided that the math did not work. They had been doing the wrong math. A ship is not its hull. It is not its engine count or its age or its record of battles. A ship is the decision to fix it when everyone else has decided fixing it is not worth the trouble. The Ardent Grave was 900 meters of the wrong math made right. The galaxy had given it away for 40,000 credits. It would not be making that kind of mistake again.